All right. I'm back. You're back at Ground Zero Salem with your host, Pat. So I was kind of hemming and hawing. I was not really thinking about what I was going to talk about this week. And then I remembered at some point I promised you fine people that I would do a series of stuff that I thought should have been in my top 100. There wasn't room for everything. I didn't think of everything at the time. Just to reiterate what that whole series was about, I'll put a link to it here. I was bored at work. Usually I'm very busy at work, but I had one day where I had a little free time, so I scrawled down just off the top of my head over the course of maybe 20 minutes to a half an hour my favorite albums of all time. This is, of course, extremely arbitrary. Most of the videos did pretty well. People seem to enjoy them. I thought it would be a good challenge to do a Mojo style, like top 100 of my tastes, and trying to weigh a couple of different factors, nostalgia, influence, amount of times I've spun them, whether they still hold up for me. All these are kind of like amorphous sort of metrics in my brain that went into putting stuff in the top 100 and what rank they went in, But of course, like anything else, any sort of situation like this, you're going to have some glaring omissions that you think of afterwards. You're going to go, oh, what was I thinking not putting that in there? There's a few that I was like, I can't think of one specific album by a band I really love so much. There's so many other records that I love equally, so I'm not putting any in because I gave myself the silly rule of only one album per band. So there's some examples of that. I thought I'd do an update, or maybe two, maybe three, very important records to me that should be in my top 100. So without further ado, in no particular order, I'm not going to rank these. I'm a little burnt on ranking still. I just kind of off the top of my head, once again, went through the stacks today and pulled out, I think there's 15 in here or so, records that are extremely important to me that I still listen to all the time and are definitely in the upper echelons of my favorite records of all time. So one that got the boot, getting started right away, one that got the boot unfairly, but it was kind of at the last minute and I couldn't think of a good place exactly to put it because important record for me, first thing I heard by this band, but I don't love it as much as I used to, and I like a lot of their earlier stuff better now, but I still listen to this into the ground. It was just tough, so it just got kind of clipped. But certainly one of my favorite records ever is Sepultura's Arise. This came out 1990 or 1991. Super formative for me. The Dead Embryonic Cells music video was all over Headbangers Ball at the time. Was a starter pack death metal record for me, even though by today's standards, it's not really considered death metal, more like brutal thrash or death thrash or something like that. The gruff vocal stuff. This was one of the first things I ever got into. Kind of kiddie steps before getting into Cannibal Corpse and Deicide and everything. Awesome riffing, of course. This is one of those records that I've listened to so much, it's just embedded in my brain. I love it. It's great. Years later, I got to appreciate Beneath the Remains probably more. Initially, for whatever reason, because I remember reading about Arise and, reviews of them and people talking about how Beneath the Remains broke Sepultura in the US and how it was a more technical offering. I liked it, but at the time I needed something a little bit more immediately aggressive. Sometimes Beneath the Remains goes off and meanders a little bit more, whereas Arise is a little bit more to the point. I could appreciate that meandering more as the time went on, the kind of longer songs and stuff like that. Both are totally vicious records. And of course, going back to Schizophrenia and Bestial Devastation and all that stuff, all their stuff leading up to this is great. I also loved Chaos AD when it came out. It was a big game changer, kind of uniting hardcore kids and metalheads at the time, at least in my scene. That one is a little bit more divisive. I feel like people that are like pure true metalhead types are kind of divided on that, but I love it. Anyways, complete rundown of all the early Sepultura stuff. Arise, Sepultura should have been mentioned, certainly. I mentioned Danzig 1. That was pretty far up there for me. I don't really think I didn't talk about the Misfits or Samhain in my top 100, which is kind of a shame. Misfits, to me, their legacy is a little bit tarnished by everything they did after they reformed. Although I don't absolutely hate the Michael Graves stuff. I kind of wish the band was named something else. All that early stuff was super formative for me. I remember hearing buying Earth AD and Danzig 2 at the same time and being utterly confused how it was the same guy singing for both bands. And then discovering Walk Among Us and just the infectiousness of it. If I were to put a top Misfits record, one that I'm not totally burnt out on, because it is a band that's easy to burn out on over the years, in my opinion, probably be Earth AD, because it's so noisy and weird. I love Earth AD. It's also the most like aggressive and kind of hardcore punk of the records. Samhain, however, it wasn't hard for me to pick a Samhain record, although I do like everything they did. Initium is it for me. It's my favorite Samhain record. It probably would have been in the top 20 somewhere if I'd sat down and thought about it longer. I just like how they were kind of toying with a lot of death rock kind of stuff at the time. There's an overwhelming, suffocating atmosphere to all their records, particularly this one, but it retains a lot of that sort of Misfits catchiness with the choruses to like He Who Cannot Be Named, of course, All Murder, All Guts, All Fun, Black Dream, Archangel, a song that Glenn Danzig wrote for Dave Vanian from The Damned. One of my favorite songs, not let alone Samhain songs, one of my favorite songs of all time. Just catchy and sad. Love it. Love every track on this is great. And the iconography and the visual aesthetics and seeing these guys covered in blood in like a Thrasher magazine in like 1989 definitely captured my imagination. Life, Love, Regret by Unbroken. I booted this in favor of The Promise by Ringworm. It's tough because The Promise by Ringworm, I think I mentioned this, was like immediately satisfying. This up-tempo mix of like hard, like sort of New York hardcore-ish kind of stuff with darker, weirder elements and blast beats and just nothing like it, Another album that's sonically kind of in the same camp somewhat, this early metalcore stuff, metallic hardcore stuff, was this Unbroken record. I'd had their previous one, Ritual. I thought it was okay. It kind of reminded me a bit of Strife, kind of up-tempo, metal-tinged, straight-edge hardcore stuff. This one gets a lot more dark. There's a lot more, like, blatant Slayer, Hella Waitsy kind of Slayer riffs going on with it. More South of Heaven, actually, Slayer riffs going on with it, if you want to split hairs. And one of the bands to do that before a lot of other hardcore bands started, like, straight up aping Slayer, like a lot of the Hate Thousand stuff and early metalcore stuff. Really desperate kind of vocals, hoarse vocals, sort of personal and political lyrics, very dark songs involving SI and things like that, and in a pretty mature way. They were coming out of San Diego, where a lot of people were influenced by death rock and goth without like straight up aping that style. A lot of people in the hardcore scene, the 31G kind of screamo-ish scene, for lack of a better term. Just awesome, iconic stuff. And then after this, they went on to be way noisier, a lot less straightforward. This was kind of an interesting gap between their stuff that was Strife adjacent, I guess, and stuff that was a little bit more like typical San Diego, noisy, bombastic. Was this sort of like falling apart at the seams, nervous breakdown, Slayer riff kind of record. It's great. Kind of a similar theme in some ways, lyrically, on some songs. River Runs Red by Life of Agony. This was a big one. I couldn't get around the vocals for the first couple of spins of this. I was like, why is this singer trying to sound like a grunge singer to like a heavier, moshy kind of hardcore band? And then after a while, it just kind of sunk in, and I was humming all the songs. It was one of these bands, like Integrity is one of them. Into Another was another one of them, where my friends and I would make fun of the vocalist all the time. And then eventually it just got to the point where we were just singing along and just totally enjoying it. This is a great example of that. I mean, they went on to do a lot more commercial stuff after this. The stuff leading up to this was way more traditional, kind of metallic New York hardcore stuff. This was their breakout record. I feel like there was kind of a signing frenzy and a lot of eyes from bigger labels in looking at Brooklyn at the time, specifically Roadrunner, with Biohazard, Life of Agony, and Typo Negative. Of course, I think that had to do with Carnivore being on Roadrunner before, and certain people probably being in the scene, being involved with checking out the hardcore stuff, signing it onto a big metal label and everything. Certain reps that were in touch with what was going on. But yeah, like an iconic record, kind of game changing in a lot of ways. I feel like a lot of stuff that was influenced by it after might have been stuff that might not have been so great, like along the lines of nu metal and stuff like that. But I can't really speak to that too much because I don't listen to anything like that in terms of like, the more butt rocky nu metal stuff. I know there's a lot of newer hardcore bands like Twitching Tongues. They're not even new anymore really, but a lot more current hardcore bands that have been influenced by Life of Agony in the past like 10 or 15 years or so, kind of going back to that influence, but there was nothing like it at the time. Great live band too. Then we've got, well, this is the discography, but the specific LP is Bringing It Down by Judge. When I discovered Judge, I listened to it nonstop, listened to both of their 7-inch and the LP, Bringing It Down. I had both on the same CD. And just like really desperate, pissed, straight edge hardcore. It's interesting how, going back and looking at it, a lot of people were like, yeah, they weren't a crossover band, but they had certain metal dynamics. Certain people drew certain comparisons of the dynamics to like Ride the Lightning. Just the space between the riffs and just the epic feel of some of the stuff. There are some solos and everything like that. Very dark, intense, angry, personal kind of lyrics. A big straying away from the positive Youth Crew stuff, which I think was a necessary step forward, a necessary evolution of that particular scene. Big deal for me there. Love that one. Dead Guy, Fixation on a Coworker. Wearing the shirt today too. Big one for me. Took me a while to come around to this. I didn't really start appreciating Dead Guy probably almost 10 years after they'd broken up, like in mid-2000s, late 2000s. When they were big, I specifically remember writing a review in my zine at the time that never came out for a band called Devoid of Faith, who I still love and deserve a spot in this pile. Probably the next video I do of stuff that should have been in the top 100. I'll talk about Devoid of Faith. But I remember Devoid of Faith had a lot of feedback and noisy elements. They were kind of crusty, kind of hardcore. But I remember writing, these guys deserve the term noisecore, not that Dead Guy crap. And I think it was because at the time I was very opposed to anything super chunky or metallic. It was like around the time I was between high school graduation age and like going to college. I was super getting into crust and stuff like that. I didn't want to hear anything metallic in the way of this kind of stuff. I don't know. I came around, a while later and got to really respect the weird disjointed nature of the way these songs are written. Again, like crazy, like kind of stream of consciousness, very pained lyrics and vocals. These guys were very influenced by metal. They came out of that Jersey scene, growing up, probably going to Human Remains shows and Ripping Corpse shows and that sort of stuff. There's this thread of like this really weird, discordant metal coming out of Jersey. And Dead Guy was almost kind of like a crossover from that into hardcore. Members of No Escape, Tim Singer, great vocalist, went on to do Kiss It Goodbye. Dead Guy are back together now, playing shows again. Their new record that came out last year was awesome. But this sort of choppy, discordant, skronky, weird guitar approach, odd like pinch harmonics and just herky-jerky kind of stuff with their music is just awesome. Then Death, Human. This is one of those bands where I was like, well, how do I pick one Death record? Maybe I'll just skip it altogether. Another example of like I haven't really sat down and listened to Death like in a while, like years at this point, I think. And the last thing I did listen to by them was just like their old demos, just kind of getting familiarized with those. But this was the first one that I really got into, and I don't know where it stands with a lot of people. I think a lot of people it's their favorite record, but I think a lot of people are kind of ho-hum about it. To me, it was just as technical as Death needed to be. Catchy, really interesting song structures, great growls by Chuck that are like semi-understandable, completely evolved out of the kind of the gore lyrics by now, kind of getting into weird sci-fi territory with Cosmic Sea and Vacant Planets and that stuff. Got the God of Thunder cover as a bonus on this one. Suicide Machine, it's like Kevorkian song. I love this record. Listen to it a ton. Then MC5 self-titled. So last year around this time, I was going on a big jag of this stuff. It was a weird kind of listening spree that came from wanting to listen to like raw rock and roll leaning punk stuff, which led me into the 70s wormhole with a lot of proto-punk like MC5 and the Stooges, which eventually led me back to weird prog and doom metal, and then whatever. I've emerged from that and been listening to a ton of black metal because it's winter. At any rate, got me to kind of revisit MC5, watch some videos on them and stuff like that. I listened to this record a ton when I first got it, and I've been revisiting it a bunch lately. It's definitely a killer record. It's live. It's completely live, but it's up there with like one of the most influential punk records, blah, 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 blah. Motor City 5, they were a Detroit band, just like really angry hippies, basically, You've probably heard Kick Out the Jams if if you've listened to any kind of rock and roll. And it's awesome. I didn't like a lot of the rest of the record. A few songs, Ramblin' Rose, Kick Out the Jams, maybe one or two others. They go into some weird territory, especially with the closing song Starship, which is it's like a psych song, basically. It goes into weirdo zone. Now I'm totally on board for that. And I like everything MC5's recorded that I can get my hands on. Then this was a dumb one for not including. I definitely should have put this somewhere, probably in the top 25, but Ashes to Ashes by Final Conflict. One thing I can always say that's great about Relapse and give Relapse their flowers for is their reissue game. Now they're reissuing all this great Japanese stuff, and they've always been good with, especially with hardcore, especially with the type of hardcore that metalheads like. They're very, very good with putting that stuff back out. This got reissued by Relapse, I want to say, in the late 90s. I think it brought it to a whole new audience that might not have checked it out. This copy is an OG press, not to flex or anything, on Pussmort. And what we have here is super tight California hardcore punk, heavily influenced by a lot of the British stuff. You can hear a Discharge influence, but it's got some kind of blazing metallic elements to it. I wouldn't say enough to call it crossover, but it's getting there. You know what I mean? But yeah, a lot of trade-off choruses, back and forth kind of vocal trade-off stuff, kind of shouted things, and very heavy and blazing and catchy. I'd say that there's a fair amount of American kind of West Coast snottiness to it as well that I really appreciate. But I feel like there was more of this going on the West Coast that was kind of looking a little bit more towards like the UK for influences, stuff like Iconoclast and Against and bands of that nature. One newer death metal band that I've really loved, and I've kind of kicking myself for forgetting also, is Bone Sickness, Theater of Morbidity. This is one of those bands, kind of like Necrofilth, who just got the formula right with the one-footed blasts, taking equal slaughter and repulsion and maybe a little bit of like Nihilist or something like that. Just, the faster Autopsy stuff, all that kind of raw death metal, early grind kind of vibes, it just captured perfectly and condensed down into something, kind of its own style. It could easily fit in with any of those bands, but not a worship of any of them in particular. This is just a quality death metal record. I love this. Kind of keeping it in death metal. Horror of the Zombies by Impetigo. Yeah, this should have been on there somewhere. It's a no-brainer. It's a death metal classic. I like this one out of the two LPs the most, just because it's got that sort of pummeling sort of thing. You could tell they were maybe getting into doomy stuff or Autopsy a little bit more. I Work for the Street Cleaners worth the price of admission alone. It's just creepy, looming, sort of overwhelming. It's got that great sound clip from Deadbeat at Dawn, that iconic sound clip. This just seems like it's got a little bit more like songwriting maturity, if you want to use that term, than the previous stuff. Although I like everything going back to the demos as well. Just classic Midwestern, just sloppy, gore-ridden, but catchy death metal. And Hooded Menace, Fulfill the Curse. This was like right when I was getting back into like modern death metal stuff that was coming out, the new wave of old school style death metal, or whatever annoying, embarrassing title you want to give it. Bands that were coming out doing stuff in the 90s old way. Hooded Menace was one of the first ones that I checked out, and this was just immediately so alluring to me. Got the black and white, high contrast kind of cover. The music was a great combination of death metal with a little bit of like 90s heavy doom to it. Like I could taste a little bit of Forest Equilibrium in there, maybe some Winter or something like that. Obviously, strong Ripikulu influence. Lassi Pico came from the old Finnish death metal scene, and you could hear the love he had for that scene and that style just all over the grooves of this record. Great record, and most of the stuff they've done afterwards is pretty darn good too. Integrity, Those Who Fear Tomorrow. So Integrity, a band I've listened to hours and hours and hours of, probably hundreds of hours of over the years. It's hard to pick a favorite. Like their first 3 or 4 records are all kind of significantly different in their own way. Not radically, but enough to make it a hard decision of which one I'm going to pick. I like Systems Overload because that's one that was kind of challenging the status quo of what was going on with hardcore. Everybody was playing kind of more mid-tempo, crunchy stuff for the most part, at least on Victory at the time. And they had, with no solos and stuff like that, and they had a song, an opening song that was blazing fast with nothing but solos all over it. It's got a pronounced like Japanese hardcore little tinge going on there. Discharge influence, as well as the patented sort of Cleveland love for Cro-Mags and Judge and everything like that weaved in. And the weird Church of Holy Terror influence. Not the calm before the storm by any stretch of the imagination, but this is kind of the prelude leading up to them defining their identity, or Dwid helping define their identity a little bit more. This is very early 90s, I think. Maybe even as early as 89. A little bit tinnier sounding. A little bit more compressed, Metal Zone pedal kind of sound to it. Which was a detractor for me when I was younger. I always liked the production of all their records after this a little bbit more. But something about this is just so nasty. There's less kind of international hardcore influences, I'd say, with it. It's less like kind of Discharge-y or whatever. There's more like straight up Slayer and Metallica mixed with NYHC, but it still has that looming darkness to it that like nothing at the time did. And when I feel like when this came out, it came out a few years before I came around, but the influence was massive. Like everybody in the straight edge hardcore scene or anything adjacent to it was just playing stuff that was so much heavier and more metallic after this came out. Combination of this and probably like Inside Out, Rorschach, and all this, a handful of bands, like 4 or 5 bands, I feel really changed the face of hardcore. And this was a big part of that. And it didn't hurt that everybody in this band could play their asses off. The Melnicks, awesome players. Everything on this just rips. And it's just so venomous and so dark. I do like the blazing nature of Systems Overload a lot. Humanity is the Devil kind of got back into a little bit more like moshy, chunky, metallic stuff here and there. Seasons, it was a grower for me. I didn't really like it that much at first, but right now I'm going to go with Integrity, Those Who Fear Tomorrow as my, why didn't I pick this? What was I thinking? Record for Integrity. All right, and then finally, at least for now, we'll end this on some North Carolina nasty rock and roll kind of punk stuff. Here to Ruin Your Groove by Antiseen. Antiseen, awesome band. I'd say they have a lot of appeal to people who like early Motorhead if you haven't messed with that. Not that they sound directly like that, but it's got gravelly vocals. It's very fast, up-tempo rock and roll. There's a lot of like tongue-in-cheek kind of stuff, a lot of nods to pro wrestling. They even have a couple of different compilations of them doing songs just about wrestlers. Most of their albums have at least one. The one on here is Funk You, about Terry Funk. And their wrestler songs, I feel like, are like their best jams. It's just gnarly, knuckle-dragging, boogie rock-infused hardcore punk. It's really raw, too. One good thing about them is they never got too overproduced. They have some stuff that's well-produced. This is like perfect production for the sound that they had. It's like how could I describe this? I don't know, a gnarly mix-up of like the faster Ramones stuff, Motorhead, a little like rhythm and blues, like old school soul thrown in there, gravelly vocal stuff, maybe a touch of southern rock here and there, a little Molly Hatchet kind of inflections, but stripped down. Awesome band. I love Antiseen. I got to see them once right before I moved back in Charlotte in their hometown. It was everything I'd hoped it to be. Jeff was playing washboard. It was great. They had backup singers. It was killer. That's about it for right now. I had to blaze through that because it's another busy day. But hey, you know how it goes. I hope all of you have a good rest of your week. Take care. Be sure to like, subscribe, and comment if you feel like it. Bye.